announcement that these 12 would have these exalted positions in his earthly kingdom, that they became quite eager at any time that they approached the Mount of Olives. And here in the 19th chapter of Luke, they're coming up from the city of Jericho. Jericho was on one of the main ways of travel from the northern part of the country where Jesus ministered into Judea, and they'd passed through that way when they came to the feasts that were held at Jerusalem. And he had just been there and healed the blind Bartimaeus. And remember, it was there in Jericho on this particular trip that he had his encounter with Zacchaeus, the publican. And so they were on their way up to Jerusalem, and Christ was speaking to them. And then they said something that caused him to know that they thought that he was now going to establish his kingdom. He said that he had told them that he was going to do such, and they tended to hear that part a little more than they heard the part that he was going to the cross and suffer and so forth. So we'll read here in Luke chapter 19, beginning with verse 11. And as they heard these things, he added and spoke a parable, because he was near unto Jerusalem, and because they thought that the kingdom of God should immediately appear. And they were really ready for it, seeing as how he just told them about their exalted position in that kingdom. And he said, therefore, a certain nobleman went into a far country to receive for himself a kingdom and to return. And he called his 10 servants and delivered them 10 pounds and said unto them, Occupy till I come. But his citizens hated him and sent a message after him, saying, We will not have this man to rule over us. And it came to pass that when he was returned, having received the kingdom, then he commanded these servants to be called unto him, to whom he had given the money, that he might know how much every man had gained by trading. Now, we'll not read the entire story here, but you can see, those of you who've read the Bible enough to know what the prophetic messages are, you can readily see that Christ is speaking of himself. He is that king that has gone into a far country, and he has left his kingdom in charge of others, and he is coming again to reward them. And while he's gone, the citizens as a whole don't want him to reign over him. As a matter of fact, when he came and offered himself to the nation of Israel as their king and offered to rule the world through them, they rejected him. As the Bible says, he came unto his own, but his own received him not. So we can readily see that this is a story Christ is telling concerning himself, and he's letting the people know, or his followers know, that he is not going to set up a kingdom immediately. Now, he is going to set up a kingdom. This happened almost 2,000 years ago, and that kingdom is not set up yet. Jesus Christ has a kingdom. He has a kingdom here on earth, and it's for our time because, for instance, in the book of Colossians, we're told that we have been translated into the kingdom of God's dear Son. Jesus Christ is a king today, but his kingdom is not in manifestation, and his primary office at the present time is that, as far as we're concerned, of a high priest, and rather than that of a king. But he does have a kingdom. It's just that this world does not recognize it. The kingdom is not in manifestation. That prayer has not been answered yet, which his followers have been praying down through the centuries. That is to say, Our Father which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. That prayer has never been answered. His will is not being done on earth as it is in heaven. But it will be one day. And the Bible is very clear in explaining that Christ is going to visibly come and set up a kingdom. And he tells in the 24th and 25th chapters of Matthew exactly when that will be. As a matter of fact, we might look there again in chapter 25 of Matthew, verse 31. When the Son of Man shall come in his glory, and all the holy angels with him, then shall he sit upon the throne of his glory. And this whole 24th and 25th chapter of Matthew have to do with the events that transpire between the time he spoke these words, almost 2,000 years ago, and the time that this kingdom would come into actual manifestation. And his emphasis here is on those events that shall immediately portend his coming again. So the Bible doesn't leave us wondering when it will be. All we'd have to do is read and study carefully the events predicted in Matthew 24 and 25, and we would understand that the time is not yet, but it is very, very close. There's just a few things that must take place before the kingdom is manifested. One of these few things, of course, is the taking away of the church out of this world and the ushering in of this time of great tribulation. Now, why are we saying all of this? Because these 8 parables in Matthew 13 have to do with that period of time, beginning at his rejection and ending when he comes back again in manifestation. Now, that would have to be at least 7 years in the future, because the 70th week of Daniel, which is a 70-year period, must occur after God takes his children to be home with him. So we know that the end of this period that Christ is speaking of is not tomorrow or the next day. It has to be at least 7 years from now, even if the rapture were tonight, that which we call the rapture. Anyway, the period of time that's explained by these 8 parables in Matthew 13 is this period of time from when he was speaking back then until the time when he comes. It's not exactly parallel with that, what we call the church age, because the church age will reach its consummation before Christ sets up his kingdom again. Now, we had this chart that we made here for a little different purpose, but if the outer ring here represents the world and all the people in it, then what Christ is doing today, or what he has done, he has put something in the world. He has set up a program in the world, and people are touched by that program, or they're involved in the program. And those who are involved in the program are represented by that second circle, but with the broken line around it, and represent all the people who claim to be a part of what Christ is doing on earth. You know, he's made quite an impact on this earth. For instance, in a good part of the civilized world, most of the major holidays have to do at least with the world's idea of what Christianity should be all about. For instance, Christmas has quite of an impact on the whole world, doesn't it? And certainly the calendar has an impact on the world. And we even speak of BC and AD, which means the year of our Lord, and so forth. So our whole calendar and much of this world revolves around that which Jesus started. But that which Jesus started is a mixture of what he is doing and what someone else is doing to try to thwart or dilute what he's doing. And that's what these parables are all about. They're to help those of us who are part of what he is doing, and those of us who want to be a part of what he's doing, help us to understand that everything that's emanating from that is not at his direction and not exactly as it should be. There's a lot of evil in what we would call Christianity. It should be very obvious to us that if all that's in the name of Christ, in the name of Christendom, if all of that were actually begun by Christ and actually looked over and guided by him, you wouldn't go somewhere and find on 4 squares of one community 4 different denominational churches, would you? You know, right soon after I came to Christ, I set up a new agency for my company in the town of Port Charlotte. And this was a very big development down there. I don't know how many of you have been there. But when the people developed Port Charlotte, they decided that a certain part of the land should be set aside for churches to build. So they offered any church group that wanted to, they offered them free land to come there and build their church. And so there was one particular area there, and there was a Lutheran church on this corner, and a Catholic church on this corner, and a Presbyterian church on this corner, and Congregational church on that corner. And then the others were ready to be built. And on Sunday, you see, everybody would go in the same direction to worship the same God. And then when they get right to that spot where they were all going, then they would divide out, and these would have it their way, and those would have it their way. You say, well, now, God wouldn't do something like that, would he? No, if he had true believers and true followers all over that community, what he would do, he would have a few of them meet on this side of town, and a few on that side, and a few on that side, and a few on this side. Not all of them together, right in one little pot full, but yet dividing themselves and separated itself. And it just pointed out, of course, we have that everywhere. The same general type of thing. We go by, most of us, when we go to church on Sunday morning, we pass by several other churches, don't we? Because they don't do it just like we think you're supposed to do it. Well, now, obviously, Jesus didn't start this up. And so these parables are to help us to understand why the, quote, Christian world that we live in is like it is. And we've studied the first parable, and we found out one reason it's like it is because the reaction is not the same on the part of all the people that hear his message. Some is exemplified by the hard ground. They pay no attention to it whatsoever. They hear it, and they know it's something's going on. I remember 2 or 3 weeks ago, my daughter Denise was singing in a chorale, a singing group, in a church in the little tiny town of Pine Castle, which is just below Orlando. And so my wife and I wanted to go up and hear her sing on this Sunday night. So, you know, it's a little town. And they told us that they were singing at the Pine Castle Baptist Church. So we asked them before they went, well, it's the main Baptist, it's only the real Baptist church there in Pine Castle, you know. And so it says right off the main drag. So we went all the way through town on the north-south street, and we didn't see any sign or anything that said Pine Castle Baptist Church. So there was a little convenience store open, and so we went in there, and there's several people in there. And I stopped each one of them, and I asked them if they could tell me where the Pine Castle Baptist Church was. And one of the guys says, for instance, well, now there's quite a few churches here in this town, I know. Now there's a big one right down there. I said, well, I saw that sign, and it said Methodist Church. He said, oh, well, that's not what you're looking for. Well, anyway, I looked around several places. I asked about 5 people in that little convenience store, including the proprietor. And finally, one of them said that he remembers seeing the name Baptist on a sign, and he told me how to get there. And it was about 2 miles out of town. But I came there, and we passed several other churches and so forth, and I didn't think that was right. So I asked 2 or 3 other people. No, they didn't know. Stopped in another convenience store, and it was a bunch of people from Cuba, and I'm not sure they understood English. But anyway, I finally went into this one Baptist church and found the lady that was keeping the nursery, and she told me about where she thought it was. So I went back there, and I didn't find it. So we looked in the phone book. Under, Baptist. We knew it was a Southern Baptist church, and looked under that, and there was no churches listed as the Pine Castle Baptist Church. In fact, there were no Baptist churches under P at all. And so I stopped in another place where they had taxis and things like that to go out to the airport, and there's a fellow there, kind of a seedy-looking fellow. And he says, that's right down there. I said, no, I was by that 2 or 3 times. That's a Methodist, Baptist, So I'll tell you what, we wandered around that little town for a good half hour, hunting the Pine Castle Baptist Church. Well, the reason we couldn't find the phone book is it was the First Baptist Church of Pine Castle, and so it was listed under the F's instead of the P's. But we must have asked easily 12 to 15 people, and it's probably the second biggest church in the whole town, and none of them, on a Sunday night, knew where that church was. They just didn't know. They knew that there were churches around, and they knew that there was such a thing, as people going to churches. But they just didn't pay that much attention to it. Now, this really struck me, in a so-called Christian country where that many people in a little town like that didn't know what we were looking for. Well, anyway, we need to help understand that. Well, as this first parable we studied said, that the whole idea of why Christ came into this earth falls on deaf ears. They know there's a big hullabaloo at Christmas time and another one of some sorts at Easter time, and they know that there's the biggest building in a lot of towns or churches with high steeples and all that, you know. They know that there's something going on, but they just couldn't be less interested. It just doesn't touch them in any way. And then we have another group of people that say, yeah, well, sure, I'm part of that, you know. I'm Lutheran, I'm Baptist, I'm a this, I'm a that, the other thing, you know. But they're really in the world, except they just sort of join up with it in some way. But Christ isn't running their lives either. And they're sort of represented by this second inner group with the gray there part. Then we have another group we found that really hear and really assimilate it, but because of the cares of this world and the things, you know, just things and deceitfulness of riches or this or that or the other thing, they never really get involved in what's going on. It's just a little tiny nucleus. Well, here's what these parables are all about. Jesus is telling the little nucleus of people that really want to be a part of what God's doing in the world, he's telling them how to understand the environment that they find themselves in. And he's putting it in such language that curious ears don't understand it. But his real followers can understand it, and they're fruitful. Now, tonight we're going to read 3 more of these parables. And all of these first 4, including the 3 we're going to read tonight, were spoken to the multitude. And then after he told the whole multitude about them, then he's going to explain them just to his followers. That is, he's going to explain 2 of them. But while he's explaining those 2, he's telling them, now you can interpret all of the parables by the information I'm giving you about these 2. Now here's an interesting thing. Between the explanation of the first parable and the explanation of the second parable, we have 2 more parables. In other words, as it's written here in Matthew, we have parable 1, then its explanation. Then parable 2, then parable 3, then parable 4, then the explanation of parable 2. So parables 3 and 4 are sandwiched in between parable 2 and the explanation of parable 2. Now, if you read the account in all of the Gospels where you find them, you'll come to the conclusion that they weren't told in this way. What Christ did, he told 4 parables. Then his disciples, when he took them to himself, they asked him what it was all about. And what he did, he explained 2 of the 4, the first 2, and then he told them 4 more, just to themselves. But they're recorded for us in this way. One of the reasons they're recorded, because the 3rd and 4th one are very short. And this is God's way of letting us know, it's kind of his code for letting us know that all of these 4 are tied in together. And they have the same general theme. And he's just telling this theme in 4 different stories because we get a little different aspect behind it. But basically, what it's telling us is this, that he started something good, but somebody else has muddied up the water. They've thrown junk in the spring, so to speak. And the spring's still there, but it's not all what it's supposed to be. And God did start it. And that God started, that part of it's still good. But from an outward viewpoint, what we tend to see is more of that which the interloper put into it. So let's read in Matthew chapter 13, verse 24, another parable put he forth unto them, saying, the kingdom of heaven is likened unto a man. Now this will throw you off if you're not careful. He's going to say the kingdom of heaven is likened unto a man. He's going to say it's likened unto a grain of mustard seed. He's going to say it's likened unto leaven. He's going to say it's likened unto all these things. Well, he doesn't mean that it's likened unto that particular item that he points out. but it's likened unto the whole story that he's going to tell, that he just starts with a word. So it's not likened unto a man here. The kingdom of heaven is not likened unto a man. It's likened unto a man who sowed good seed in his field, and while men slept, his enemy came and sowed tares among the wheat and went his way. And when the blade was sprung up and brought forth fruit, then appeared the tares also. So the servants of the householder came and said unto him, Sir, didst not thou sow good seed in thy field? From where then hath it tares? He said unto them, An enemy hath done this. The servant said unto him, Wilt thou then that we go and gather them up? But he said, Nay, lest while ye gather up the tares, ye root up also the wheat with them. Let them both grow together until the harvest. And in the time of the harvest I will say to the reapers, Gather together first the tares, and bind them in bundles to burn them, but gather the wheat into my barn. Now, the kingdom of heaven is like that whole story, not just the first word in it. That's what he's saying. This is a parallel. He's saying, the scope of my operation, or that which has arisen out of what I started, when I started my kingdom here on this earth, not in manifestation, but in a hidden form, when I started that, something came of it. And I'm giving you some descriptive material concerning that. Verse 31, And another parable put he forth unto them, saying, The kingdom of heaven is like a grain of mustard seed. Now, it's not like a grain of mustard seed. It's like a grain of mustard seed which a man took and sowed in the field, which is indeed the least of all seeds. But when it is grown, it is greatest among the herbs, and becometh a tree, so that the birds of the air come and lodge in it. And another parable spoke he unto them, saying, The kingdom of heaven is like leaven, which a woman took and hid in 3 measures of meal, till the whole was leavened. And these things spoke Jesus unto the multitudes in parables. See, he spoke these 4 parables to the multitudes. And without a parable spoke he not unto them. Now, we've covered this before. It means at this particular time. Now, he'd been speaking to them for 12 chapters in Matthew, and most of what he said was not even in parabolic form at all. It was just plain speech. But at this occasion, he was speaking to them only in parables, and he told us in the first, earlier in the chapter, why. It was so that the spiritual truths could only be understood by those to whom he wanted it understood. But he said all these things unto the multitudes in parables, and without a parable spoke he not unto them, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the prophet, saying, I will open my mouth in parables, I will utter things which have been kept secret from the foundation of the world. Then Jesus sent the multitude away. Here's the key. He's going to explain the parable, but watch, before he does, Jesus sent the multitude away and went into the house, and his disciples came unto him, saying, Explain unto us the parable of the tares of the field. So he's going to explain it. And he answered and said unto them, He that soweth the good seed is the Son of Man. Now, most of you will recognize this term, the Son of Man, is the favorite name of Christ for himself. Christ is designated by 7 titles in the first chapter of the book of John. John the Beloved calls him 2 titles, and then John the Baptist calls him 2 titles, and then Nathan calls him by 1, Andrew by 1, and then Christ calls himself by 1. He's called in that the Son of God. He's called the light of the world. He's called the Lamb of God. He's called by 7 titles, but when it all ends up, the chapter ends up by him designating himself the Son of Man. You see, his actions proclaim him as the Son of God. Nobody but God can still the waves and raise people from the dead and forgive sins. And he's just done all these miracles. 10 of them are recorded in Matthew chapter 8 and 9. 10 miracles that could not possibly have come about except by the very power of God. So he proved himself the Son of God by his actions. But he's proclaiming himself the Son of Man. He's saying God became man. That's what he's saying. Through his actions and his words. He's saying God became man. I'm the one who does these godly deeds, these of an omnipotent one. I'm the one doing in your presence, and I am a Son of Man. He's God become man. That's why he calls himself that. So when he's talking, it says the Son of Man, he's talking about himself. as God became man. So he says in verse 37 again, he answered and said unto them, He that soweth the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world. The good seed are the children of the kingdom, but the tares are the children of the wicked one. The enemy that sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the world, and the reapers are the angels. As therefore the tares are gathered and burned in the fire, so shall it be at the end of the world, or the end of the age. The Son of Man shall send forth his angels, and they shall gather out of his kingdom all things that offend, and them that do iniquity, and shall cast them into a furnace of fire. There shall be wailing and gnashing of teeth. Then shall the righteous shine forth as the sun. He's quoting Daniel chapter 12, verse 2 here. Then shall the righteous shine forth as the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Who hath ears to hear, let him hear. The Apostle Paul tells us, we have the kingdom of the Son here, and we have the kingdom of the Father. The Apostle Paul tells us that Jesus Christ is now sitting at the right hand of the Father, and that he is going to sit on a throne on this earth for 1,000 years, and then he's going to deliver up the kingdom to the Father, that the kingdom of the Father might be all in all. So there's a kingdom of the Son, and there's a kingdom of the Father. The kingdom of the Son, unfortunately, has some less than desirable aspects, because he is not manifesting himself. It won't have when he's ruling it with manifestation. But let's notice this, see? Verse 41 again. The Son of Man shall send forth his angels, and they shall gather out of his kingdom all things that offend. There must be some things in the kingdom that offend, mustn't there? If they're going to have to be gathered out. Well, they're represented by that gray part of this circle with a broken line, those things that offend. And as you can see, it represents a larger part than the smaller part. Now, so Jesus has explained this miracle, and let's kind of go over it again, this parable. First, we have this word tare. Now, tare is an old English word for some sort of weed. If you were to go over there and speak of it now, they would call it darnel, which is a name for wild wheat. And what he's saying is this. He's likening himself to someone who had a good field, and he sowed good seed in that good field. And then, no sooner had he sowed that, then somebody that didn't like him came and oversowed the field with something else. And this something else, as it's growing up, looks just like wheat. This that we're talking about, this wild wheat called darnel, called tares here, is this wild wheat looks just like wheat. You can't tell the difference, really, unless you really know your business. You can't tell the difference until it comes to head. And the wheat has a grain to it that you can make bread of. And the darnel just has little pithy stuff. Wouldn't make any bread at all. You couldn't make a loaf of bread out of a field full. But it uses up the good out of the field. So you see, the whole idea he's saying is this, that he planted something good and somebody has interspersed it, has overplanted with something that's bad, and if you look at the whole field, you can't tell one from the other. So the reaction normally would be, well, let's gather up all the bad. And he says, no, don't do that, because you can't tell the difference that well. And you'll disrupt, you'll unroot some of the good as well as the bad. You know, there's a modern paraphrase of the Bible. I think it has a reputation now of being the most widely bought book in the world, even outpacing the Bible now. And if you really want a revelation of how, in many of these paraphrases and these modern books that call themselves Bibles, if you want to see how they really miss the point, you ought to read this particular parable and the explanation in that paraphrase. They call the darnel, or the wild wheat, they call it thistles. And you miss the entire point. Anybody can tell the difference between wheat and thistles. Just pick that word out of the... Well, actually, the book was written for children, and it was thought that, children would get the point better if you could make a better distinction between one of these. So it calls it thistles. And then where it says, and while men slept, it says while the farmer slept. Well, Jesus says the farmer's him. And it's just not very nice to say Jesus went to sleep on the job, is it? Because he didn't. But the whole parable is just put askew and perverted. And yet, we don't know the difference, and we give this book around to Christians as the best thing in the world for them to read. They can't get the point of this parable, and this parable is key to understanding all the rest of these in here. Mark says, by this know all parables. He says, take the ones that are explained, and that'll explain the rest of them to you. But we don't seem to get the point, and we don't pay much attention to what we give people in the name of Christ. As long as we give it to them in the name of Christ, we think that's just the thing to do, And we're just like that. But I just wanted, if you really want to see how God's Word is perverted in many of these very popular modern translations and modern paraphrases, you just get the most well-known one in the whole bunch. You just go to any bookstore and say, what is the best-selling paraphrase of the Bible in the world today? And there won't be any question. They'll give it to you. And they'll show it to you. And read this parable in that and see how they've messed it up. And it'll give you a little insight into just what they do to what God says. Anyway, what he's telling us is that the devil has sowed people that act like Christ's fruit bearers. See, many times the Bible makes statements like, we are his husbandry. That is to say, he's growing something. And some of what he's growing is fruitful. He said that in the last parable. Jesus said it about the vine and so forth. And now the true wheat are depicted here as fruitful Christians. The tares, or the wild wheat, is speaking primarily of those who are expounding false doctrine. In the Bible, some are referred to as the children of the devil. See, he says here, when Christ is explaining this, he says what's he call them? In verse 38, the field is the world, the good seed are the children of the kingdom, but the tares are the children of the wicked one. Now, in the 8th chapter of John, Jesus is speaking to the religious leaders of his day, and he says, you are of your father, the devil. And he's speaking to the false religious leaders. And in the book of the second chapter of the book of 1 John, or I guess even more so in the 3rd chapter, he speaks of the children of the evil one. And he's speaking of those who are spokesmen for Satan. And Jesus says they are wolves in sheep's clothing. So what he's saying is, among all of these producing Christians, see, when he's speaking of the wheat, he's talking about the fruitful among these that are in God's kingdom. He's talking about that fourth group in the parable, last week's parable, the parable of the sower. The wheat represents those. See, this wheat has grown up. It's seed that came to fruition. And the wheat is in its head. And he's saying, all among those that you can look at and tell are fruitful, all among that, Satan has sowed those that look just like them, except they don't really bear any fruit. And if you look at their fruit, you can tell the difference. By their fruit ye shall know them. Now that's what this parable is saying. That we're not competent to tell. He says, but when all of this whole age goes by, before it ends, when it has reached its final consummation, you can be sure that all that would have offended has been taken out. And there'll be nothing left but wheat. because I've tended to that. I knew it was going to be like this, he says, and I've made provision for it. All right, now, we don't have an explanation for this parable that begins in verse 31, so let's read that again. Another parable put he forth unto them, saying, the kingdom of heaven is like a grain of mustard seed, which a man took and sowed in his field. All right, now in the other two parables, the man is Christ, isn't he? Christ and those who are doing his work in his name. And the field is the world. It says that. Well, just let that be the same in each parable. See, in the first parable, Christ was the sower, and the field was the world. In the second parable, the same thing. Well, let's let it be the same thing. Christ planted the seed. He sowed it in the world, which indeed is the least of all seeds. When he sowed this message of the kingdom in the world, it was a little thing. But when it is grown, it's the greatest among herbs, and becometh a tree, so that the birds of the air come and lodge in the branches of it. Now, you'd be all right if you let the birds hear mean the same thing as the birds meant over in the first parable. Remember, it was the birds were the emissaries of Satan who came and took the seed away before it could come to fruition. Well, let the birds be the same thing here, and you'll be all right. Now, what is this tree, this mustard tree, in which the birds take shelter? Well, we can find the explanation of that by seeing where else God used similar language, other than just in these parables. And if we did that, we'd find this, that he's speaking of Christianity as the world sees it. It's a great thing that has come up out of a little seed. Now, some Bible expositors see in these parables a progression of the Christian era. And I believe that they're probably right. For instance, in just one of its aspects, a minor aspect. Now, this isn't the main thing that this group of parables is teaching, but it's there. It's the same progression that you find in Revelation chapter 2 and 3, which shows the history of the church. You see, the first parable, in this respect now, you see there are more than one application to this, but in this respect we're talking about right now, the first parable represents back when the apostles were going all over the world spreading the gospel, when the main gist was getting the word out, and the word was being fruitful when it fell upon good ground. And then next we have, you remember in those letters in Revelation it speaks of where the seat of Satan is, and he's coming in doing his work, and you get this as you go in the book of Acts. You have false teachers and so forth. This is the second parable. And this third one has to do with that time when the Emperor Constantine made the whole civilized world Christian by edict. He used to take his armies and run them through the river by troops. That was baptism. And when they went in on one side of the river, they were the devil's children, and when they came out on the other side, they were part of the church. And they were baptized into the church by the armies. And so it became a big thing. He made everything Christian. And this is just an example of what, it's just an accentuation of what happens today. Why, we preach a soul-stirring sermon, you know, and then we get them to come forward, then we dunk them under and sign them up and get them going. And we get the thing organized, and we build it and build it and build it, and it grows. I mean, big. And you got to build a bigger building about every few years. Pretty soon you got something pretty big going. So it's sort of a picture of some great churches, some great denominations, but it's more of a picture of a whole thing. There's 10 times at least as many people in the Christian organization as such as there are saved people. At least 9 out of every 10. I mean, you really don't have to have a lot of spiritual discernment, and you don't have to be any sharp judge to tell this. All you have to do is to look the fruit of what people do, and it's fairly easy to tell that at least 9 out of every 10 who are part of this great thing that's called Christianity aren't born of the Spirit of God. It's a big thing. out of a little seed. Now, how do we know that that's what's being depicted here? Well, there are two other places in the Bible, in prophetic books. If you want to get the typical meaning of prophetic scriptures, you look first in the immediate context. You tie it in with the immediate context, and then you look for places in prophetic books in the Bible that use parallel systems. Now, and we won't have time to go there, but in the 4th chapter of Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar, the king, sees a great vision, and Daniel explains it to him. Well, this vision he sees is of a great tree, and it says all the birds of the air take shelter thereunder. Well, and so Nebuchadnezzar wanted Daniel to tell him, well, what does all this mean? He says, well, Nebuchadnezzar, that great tree is your kingdom. And it's grown so big that anything can hide in it. And most of what's hidden in it, you don't even know what's going on. It's such a big tree. And it's going to all be cut down. And all of this that's holed up in it is going to lose its shelter. Now, you can read that yourself in Daniel chapter 4, and you can plainly see that it has the same general application in this. Then I want to show you one other in another prophetic book, Revelation chapter 18. And here, it's going to speak of a harlot. And this harlot is called Babylon. It's spiritual Babylon, and it's very clearly the great false religious system. Revelation chapter 18, verse 1, and after these things I saw another angel come down from heaven, having great power, and the earth was lightened with his glory, and he cried mightily with a strong voice, saying, Babylon the great is fallen, and is become the habitation of devils or demons, and the hold of every foul spirit. Now you have one of those parallelisms. And a cage of every unclean and hateful bird. Now, the unclean and hateful bird is the parallel to foul spirits. Evil spirits are called fowls of the air, or birds of the air. It's called that here. It's called that by inference in 2 Timothy, where he tells us that every false religion is promulgated and instigated by evil spirits. And all you'd have to do is to read the 17th chapter of the book of Revelation, and you realize what this Babylon is that's being referred to. It's the great false religious system. What we have in this parable is a plant that should have been just a little herb in this world. It should have just been something true and small. And it's become such a great tree, bigger than all the other shrubs, it says, bigger than anything else. And here, probably it means the largest of all the religions. You see, professing Christianity is the most widespread religion in the world. It's the biggest of all the trees that harbor the birds of every sort. And it's got so big until any bird that wants to hole out in it, any bird that wants to hide in the branches has got plenty of hiding place. And there are really some birds in the branches. And that's what this parable's telling, and that's what it wants you to know, that God knew it was going to be like that. But he's going to bring it all into consummation. And you see, this should give us great hope. It looks pretty hopeless. You know, we see, well, look at Christianity. And most of the spokesmen are just a bunch of foul birds. And well, that's the way it ought to be. That's the way God said it was going to be. Now, well, why would God do it that way? Well, wait and see. If he knew it was going to be that way, and he let it come about anyway, it's going to turn out pretty good, isn't it? So we ought to say, glory be. All right, how about this next one? This fourth one, beginning with verse 33. Another parable spoke he unto them, saying, the kingdom of heaven is like leaven, which a woman took and hid in 3 measures of meal till the whole was leavened. Now, you can get some really funny explanations of what that means. But everywhere in the Bible, leaven stands for false doctrine. Everywhere. In the Gospels, by the words, by the mouth of Christ himself, he speaks of the leaven of the Pharisees and explains what it means. He says it's hypocrisy or outward religious show that has no heart meaning. That's the doctrine that is taught by the Pharisees. They were the, you might say, the ritualists of their day. They did everything by ritual, and the more ritual they had, the more proper they were, and the more they thought they were pleasing God, but they were way off. And God calls that leaven, or false doctrine, to say that the approach to God is through ritualism. And yet, I suppose the biggest part of what we call Christianity today banks on ritualism. In other words, they hold to their ritualism as their key and their mark of genuineness. Then he speaks of the leaven of the Sadducees. And he explains to his disciples. One time he says something about the leaven, and they thought he was talking about bread, and finally it says, then they recognized he was speaking of the teaching or the doctrine of the Sadducees. Well, the Sadducees were the modernists of their day. They were the ones that didn't believe in miracles, and they didn't believe in angels, and they didn't believe in resurrection, and virgin birth with them would have been just some wild story. In other words, they carried the name of religion, but they had a form of godliness but denied the power thereof. And Christ said that their teachings was leaven. That is to say, it would permeate in the whole business if you weren't careful. Then he speaks of the leaven of the Herodians. Now that was a group of Jewish religious leaders who said, you ought to placate Herod. You ought to play up to him because he has built us this big temple. And although he was an Edomite, and although he was an ungodly man, they said if you play him just right, play your politics just right, well, you can do a lot of good for God. So the most important thing in the world is doing good for God. So be good to the politicians, and then you won't to be cut down, and you can do what you need to do for God. And if you don't play with the politicians, well God will lose out. And so it's that doctrine which says that you need to acquiesce to the governmental authorities, right or wrong, and so that you can grow more. Those were the Herodians. He called that the leaven of the Herodians. And then Paul used this phrase. He used it, for instance, in the 5th chapter of 1 Corinthians, where he called malice and hatred leaven that got into the church. In other words, he's talking about those things that split churches and tear spiritual things apart and that type of thing, greed and envy and that type of thing, and he calls it leaven. And then in the book of Galatians, he says, a little leaven leaveneth the whole lump. Now, what is leaven? Leaven is a little hunk of fermented dough. You know, when your mother, if you lived long enough back in the back and your mother baked bread, well, she'd send you down to the grocery store and you'd buy some yeast. Well, the yeast was not the leaven. The yeast was just the vehicle in which the leaven germinated and all. The leaven was the actual little microbes and things that caused the fermentation. And when bread was leavened, it fermented. And what actually happened is it caused the gas, and that made the bread puff up. And before it would start putrefying, you put it in the oven and killed all the leaven. And because if you didn't, well, I'm telling you, you just have to leave that bread out overnight, and the next morning you'd never get anywhere near it because it would be putrid. And so leaven is something that will make something swell out of all proportion. And if you don't kill it pretty quick, it'll ruin whatever it's in. That's what leaven is in the Bible. And so what he's saying is that Christ is going to bake some bread for our sustenance, our spiritual sustenance. And somebody is going to put leaven in the bread, and that's going to permeate the whole loaf. And one day Christ is going to have to bake it out. And he'll put the bread in the oven and kill the leaven, and then you can eat the bread. That's the general idea of the truth that God is teaching here. That something evil has been inserted into something good. Now, the gospel message is good, isn't it? What leading people to Christ is good. But somebody has come along and put some evil in it. Now, if you don't understand that leaven always represents insidious, evil doctrines, well, you can go back from the first time it's used. Remember, the children of Israel, they had their first feast was called the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And they had to go all through their houses and make sure there was no leaven anywhere in their homes before they could use this to celebrate. And in all of the sacrifices to God, it's very plain they must have no leaven in, except when they were preparing a feast which was looking forward prophetically to the church. That, for instance, the Feast of the First Fruits would look forward to the Pentecost. And what the Old Testament was looking at in foreview, it says the church is going to come. But what you see is not going to all be what God planted. Part of it is going to be the outworking of the leaven. And wherever you see, particularly where you see a group of church-going people puffed up out of proportion, you might say, you find there's a lot of false doctrine there. And it's going to be baked out in judgment one day. You say, well, I didn't understand. Well, these parables all mean basically the same thing. They just want to give you a different view of the same overall thing. They want you to understand why things are like they are as you would work in the world today. Now, the Lord's going to tell 4 more parables. And these are going to be told only to those who have forsaken all to follow Him. And they are just for the eyes and ears of those few. The next 2, for instance, the 5th one, it just takes 1 verse to tell the whole parable. And then the 6th one, verse 44. And then the 6th one is by 2 very short verses. Now, in each of these cases, you have a man again. And the man, again, is Christ. Just let the man always be Christ. You have a man in the parable in verse 44, and you have a man in the parable in verse 45. In each case, the man is Christ. And wherever you have a field, it'll be the world. That's the way it was in the other parables. That's the way it'll be in this parable. The field will be the world. And this particular one, this 6th one, we're going to read these 2. Verse 44, and again, the kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field. God's got a treasure, and it's hidden in a field, hidden in the world. And when a man hath found, he hideth, and for joy of it goeth and selleth all that he hath, and buyeth that field. Now watch the picture. He found a treasure, and after he found the treasure, he hid it again in the same field that he found it in. He found it, then he hid it. Then he bought the whole field, not just the treasure. Then in the next one, we're not going to explain these. We'll just think about them for a week. Then in the next one, again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant man. Let Christ be the man again, and he's seeking something, and he's seeking goodly pearls. Who, when he had found 1 pearl, just one, it was a pearl of great price, he went and sold all that he had, and he bought the pearl. Okay, that's for next week. Let's pray. Lord, we thank you for these messages that you give us in this parabolic form, and we thank you because in your book is hidden the key to all of these wonderful mysteries that you're pleased to reveal to those who love you and serve you. We pray in Jesus' name, amen.